In the early 1930s, the de Havilland Aircraft Company of Stag Lane, Edgware, acquired some open farmland north of London for a new headquarters. Hatfield Aerodrome became the centre for a worldwide aviation enterprise. For 32 years, John Cunningham was chief test pilot.
From this airfield at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, I flight tested a range of aeroplanes that were to influence the course of aviation progress and make the name Hatfield world famous. It was a very exciting period. The jet engine was being developed, and aircraft were coming off the drawing board that would fly higher and faster than anything in the air. I was here and became a part of the team of skilled designers, craftsmen, and pilots who made Hatfield mean one thing: the de Havilland Aircraft Company.
It was a most exciting place to be. I couldn't imagine anything better for a young chap interested in flying, in aviation.
When I was at school and sitting, instead of doing lessons, doodling in an exercise book, I always found that the aeroplanes turned out to be tiger moths, little biplanes. And I used to go around to the airfields and look at aeroplanes and always hoped to see a tiger.
The de Havilland Tiger Moth was only one of the outstanding designs built at Hatfield. All de Havilland aircraft had a rare and totally distinctive style.
Nobody consciously put artistry into it, but somehow de Havilland aeroplanes always came out looking much better than anybody else's did. I mean, there was a saying in the company, if it looks right, it is all right. And de Havilland aeroplanes always did look beautiful.
Such beauty was the result of the genius of one man, Geoffrey de Havilland. He was not only a brilliant engineer, but also an artist. He developed, in his words, an overwhelming desire to fly. With his wife's support and some money lent by his grandfather, he designed and constructed an aircraft and specially built engine. His first aircraft crashed within yards of takeoff, but using the undamaged engine, Geoffrey quickly constructed a stronger machine and flew it successfully in 1910. This second aircraft launched Geoffrey's career as designer and test pilot of famous types such as the DH-4, built by the 1000, and Captain de Havilland in 1920 formed the de Havilland Aircraft Company Limited. The company survived on scarce military contracts and overseas orders, but it was the Moth which saved the day for de Havilland's. Launched in 1925 as a safe, attractive and affordable touring and training two-seater, it became an immediate success. Powered first by the Cirrus 60 horsepower engine and later by the long-lived Gypsy series designed by Frank Halford, the Moth was in demand everywhere, from flying clubs, enthusiastic private owners, and air forces. Moth aeroplanes reflected Geoffrey de Havilland's lifelong admiration for the natural world.
And he became very interested. He was out all day in the woods and fields looking at birds, and particularly interested in moths and butterflies, and he had a huge collection. So many are named after those species. And he was an amateur artist, a very enthusiastic and quite good artist of flowers and wildlife.
The Moth established de Havilland's as a major aircraft manufacturer, their products made famous by epic flights in the aviation-mad 1920s.
In 1926, a new airliner emerged from the de Havilland factory at Stag Lane, Edgware, near London.
Larger passenger airliners were built on this success, such as the DH-66 Hercules. With 3-engine safety, it flew up to 12 passengers on the remote air routes of the time for Imperial Airways and in Australia. By the late 1920s, the de Havilland Aircraft Company was established in all corners of the world, with Moth aircraft and Gipsy engines in huge demand. In 1930, in the middle of an economic slump, de Havillands had purchased 150 acres of farmland at Hatfield for a new airfield, away from the congestion of Stag Lane. A training school operated by de Havillands made Hatfield a popular centre for the sporting, free and easy pilots of the 30s.
Hatfield Aerodrome was built as a grass airfield. And the big difference between the airfield of today and the airfield then is that we had a big grass patch and it didn't matter which way the wind was blowing, we got a runway in every direction. So we just fly out and fly in.
The top pilots of the day were attracted, and the annual King's Cup Air Race, a social event and test of man and machine, was based at Hatfield in 1933. Captain de Havilland set out in a Leopard Moth, first flown 6 weeks previously on the 804-mile course. He returned as the popular winner of this prestigious event at an average speed of almost 140 miles an hour. In 1934, the building of a large factory was started, and with orders for Moths high again after the slump, an imposing new headquarters building took shape. This would become the nerve centre for the de Havilland enterprise and a famous landmark. John Cunningham first arrived at Hatfield as an apprentice at the de Havilland Aeronautical Technical School. The company was one of the pioneers of sponsored apprenticeships.
I joined the Havilland Technical School in the summer of 1935. My first memory of this building was when I moved into a block of flats opposite here. So I remember this very well as my first view of the Havilland aircraft. There's a wide training during which you found what area you would like to pursue, and you could concentrate on that.
It took people, senior people, graduates and so forth, and instructed them in the ways of the company. And there were also engineering apprentice streams, which is what I was doing, and trade apprentice schemes. And they were all directed at providing the right sort of people for the de Havilland company.
An early project at Hatfield was the completion of the DH-88, the famous Comet Racer. De Havilland built an aircraft with the speed and range to win the 1934 England to Australia air race and able to give the new American DC-2 a run for its money. The Comet was all wood, had a retractable undercarriage, flaps, variable pitch propellers, and was very fast. 3 Comets, costing £5,000 each, were privately entered, and Scott and Campbell Black, in Grosvenor House, reached Melbourne in under 71 hours flying time to take the McRobertson Trophy and £10,000. 5 Comets were built, of which 3 were entered in the race, and the winning aircraft survives today after painstaking restoration. The Comet established de Havilland's as leaders in the design of high-performance aircraft. But it was the Dragons, Dragon Rapides, Hornet Moths, Tiger Moths and Gypsy engines which brought financial stability. High-wing monoplanes. Luxurious biplane passenger transports. 2- and 3-seater tourers all made Hatfield a revered name in the aviation world. One of de Havilland's most beautiful types ever was the Albatross. It was intended as a transatlantic mail plane and a flagship of the Imperial Airways fleet. It first flew in 1937 and won records for fast airline schedules throughout Europe. By the late 1930s, Frank Halford's engines and de Havilland's aeroplanes were being built in ever greater numbers. Captain de Havilland's son Geoffrey assisted with test flying. The technical school produced fast racers as design exercises, such as the TK4, which claimed the life of Company Chief Test Pilot Bob Waite in 1937. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. was appointed Chief Test Pilot in his place. The King's Cup was held again at Hatfield in 1938, but the serious business of test flying attracted John Cunningham. He had learnt to fly with the RAF Reserve.
Geoffrey de Havilland, the son of the founder, had only got 2 other test pilots beside himself. Father de Havilland, who had done the original test flying on the Moth Minor, suggested that I took on the little bit of flying that was still needed on that and helped Geoffrey on production of Tiger Moths and Queen Bees. It was 1938 when there was an enormous upsurge in production here.
Tiger Moths and things like that, you would often see them in different positions waiting for pilots for test flying. You would find the pilot would get in one aeroplane and he'd just fly straight off the line and take straight off, save him 10 minutes.
I've always liked light aeroplanes, and the Tiger Moth is a classic. I trained most of the British pilots during the war. Nearly 8,000 Tiger Moths built. It's a classic aeroplane and it's great fun.
Dick Bishop's father, R.E., had, second to Sir Geoffrey, become the company's most talented designer. He was responsible for the first all-metal de Havilland type, the Flamingo. But war was approaching, and Geoffrey de Havilland and his team, thinking of the proven advantages of wood for speed and ease of construction with high performance, set to work, without government approval, on a top-secret project, the Mosquito. It was 1939, and to avoid the risk of air raids disrupting the design work, a nearby manor house was taken over.
The team came over here in 1939 to Salisbury Hall, which is why we're here now, because of the historic connections, and they really designed the aeroplane in isolation of all the activities going on at Hatfield. It was a sort of dispersed site, normal thing, which in fact eventually became the principle of the Mosquito production anyway. And having designed it in Salisbury Hall, they had a rope bridge across the moat, and they came and they actually built the first Mosquito prototype on this site where we're standing right now.
R.E. Bishop's design was a masterpiece. The design and construction team had, in record time, produced a twin-engine fighter bomber which would, in all ways, exceed the specifications laid down.
The building of the Mosquito here was done under extreme conditions. It was most unlike an aircraft factory to start with. Working facilities were very poor. There was hardly any heating worthwhile. We had a situation here which was man-to-man. It didn't matter whether you were in the design office, the stress office, whether it was the boss or who it was. you were here. And we had a lot of hard times because of the weather and rushing work to get the thing done. And we knew how to play as well. We had a couple of very nice parties here, and it had been forgotten. As we were all allowed to bring a friend over here, there was no way to the toilets at all without going through the hangar. And of course everybody realised here was a Mosquito fighter standing in the hangar for all to see. And of course questions were obviously asked by people because we had to take them through the hangar to the restroom, as it were. And we calmly told them, oh yes, we're doing some work on Oxfords, a little bit different to what the production ones are at Hatfield. And I can't recall anybody ever making any other than just say, oh, is it? That's so, you know. No questions were asked. Consequently, the secrecy was pretty good.
The first one was taken to Hatfield by road, where it made its first flight on the 25th of November 1940 by Geoffrey de Havilland Jr.
This is the last airworthy Mosquito, and like the prototype tested by Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., performs as intended, superbly. Over 7,000 were built, including more than 3,000 at Hatfield. Fighter, photo reconnaissance and night fighter derivatives gave the Mosquito a reputation as a formidably fast fighting machine and one of the most famous designs of all time. In World War II, de Havilland were building variable pitch propellers for dozens of aircraft types. A license agreement had been signed in 1934 with Hamilton Standard in America, and virtually all RAF aircraft flew with de Havilland propellers. Production of Tiger Moths, Rapides, Mosquitoes, and intense repair activity continued at Hatfield, with the disruption of frequent air raid warnings. In October 1940, 21 people died, and many more were injured when the 94 shop was hit. After this raid, Mosquito aircraft production became dispersed around the country as a strategic defense policy. A very busy test flying program continued. In 1943, Sir Geoffrey's second son, John, was killed in a Mosquito test flight collision. John Cunningham, flying night fighter Mosquitoes as CO for 85 Squadron, became a legend. In 1942, de Havilland entered the jet age. Frank Halford's Goblin turbine engine was developed in great secrecy, and it powered de Havilland's first jet, the Vampire, which first flew in 1943. The first de Havilland jet, powered by a de Havilland engine, was another milestone for Hatfield. Major A.P. Seversky was impressed.
In all my 30 years of flying, I have never had a greater thrill than flying this wonderful jet plane. More than 500 miles an hour in complete silence. This is real flying. Vampire plane is representative of creative British genius.
De Havilland aircraft continued to achieve records, and in March 1944, a Mosquito was the first twin-engined aircraft to deck land at sea. A scaled-down single-seat progression of the Mosquito, the Hornet, first flew in 1944. It was of wood and metal construction, a de Havilland innovation, had opposite rotating propellers to avoid swing on takeoff, and it too made a first landing at sea on August the 10th, 1945. In December 1945, the Vampire was the first jet to land on an aircraft carrier. De Havilland had pioneered the introduction of jet fighters, and in 1944, Captain Geoffrey de Havilland was knighted for his contribution to aviation. The war over, exciting new developments were in progress at Hatfield. An experimental aircraft, the first of 3 DH-108 tailless prototypes, was pushed out to begin a series of tests into unknown areas. The breaking of the sound barrier. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. was not to know that later that year the second prototype would claim his life. Hatfield still had no hard runway, and the first flight was from Woodbridge in Suffolk. Test flying had never reached such a pioneering stage as Sir Geoffrey de Havilland looked on.
Test flying today is much better served than we were, because so much marvelous simulator work is done before the aeroplane ever flies, and quite a lot of the problems can be faced in the simulator and rectified in many cases, as well as, of course, the general knowledge of structures and advances in aerodynamics are much better understood today than they were 40 years or 50 years ago.
The irrepressible Geoffrey Jr. celebrated his first DH-108 flight, and a few weeks later prepared for the first Vampire ferry flight to Switzerland. Being at de Havilland meant that despite the demands of test flying, there was always time for humour.
All the pilots were great jokers. There's one occasion where I can remember the jokes came a little bit unstuck. It comprised Geoffrey de Havilland, who was a great steam enthusiast. And it was the time when they were just starting to build the runway. And this traction engine used to be left at night time on the runway and left off the steam dropping off. You see, it was quite safe, but these lads had different ideas. The pilots there, they went over there and got this thing chunkering, and they drove it along the runway, and they didn't realise it, but some of it had been laid not very far from where they'd stopped, and they drove the thing straight into the concrete. They couldn't get it out.
Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. showed his mastery of the second tailless 108 at the 1946 SBAC show at Radlett. 2 years later, the 108 became the first British-built aircraft to break the sound barrier. But Geoffrey Jr., soon after the 1946 SBAC show, was killed while testing this second prototype. In May 1947, a few days before Hatfield's new concrete runway opened, John Cunningham, who had become the chief test pilot after Geoffrey de Havilland Jr.'s death, taxied out in a Vampire fitted with the new Ghost engine. Giving 5,000 pounds thrust, it was fitted in the Vampire as part of the Comet Airliner development program. John had a hectic and challenging test flight schedule, and on the 24th of July took the third tailless 108 up for its first flight. Also that day, he flight tested the Lancastrian, which was a low-level endurance testbed for the Ghost engines, which were to power the Comet, the world's first jet airliner. Test pilot Pat Fillingham put the newly introduced Chipmunk through its paces.
The Chipmunk handles like a thoroughbred, an obvious descendant of the Tiger Moth, the standard RAF trainer before, during, and since the war. "300 Doves from the Hatfield factory were put into service in some 40 countries in the first 4 years after the war, introducing to branch line air transport the small 8 to 11 passenger aircraft having features hitherto only available to mainliners.
The Dove pioneered the de Havilland method of metal-to-metal bonding known as the redux process.
The Dove's supercharged Gypsy Queen 70 is the first 6-inline engine to be geared. It drives the de Havilland feathering and braking propeller.
By 1948, jet engine development was gathering momentum. The de Havilland Engine Company had been formed in 1944, and engines were built at Leavesden, while development continued at Hatfield. A modified Ghost engine powered a Vampire which John Cunningham flew in March 1948 for a record attempt, the highest altitude ever flown at the time, nearly 60,000 feet, today's operating altitude of Concorde.
One of the problems that I faced was that having got to about 60,000 feet, the Vampire was both almost stalled and compressed at the same time. So the descent from that height had to be taken rather gently. And to increase the rate of descent, I used to put the undercarriage down at 60,000 feet. What I didn't realize at that time was that the oleos, which were extended, of course, got a vast amount of ice crystals on them, so that when I landed back on the airfield here, those ice crystals, they carved their way through the seal in the bottom of the oleo, and as a consequence, the oleo flattened. And you'll notice that on one or two photos taken taxiing in, the aircraft was all lopsided. But it was essential that I did put the undercarriage down to increase the drag so that I could come down rather more quickly. The amount of fuel I had left at the top of the climb was rather low, and I couldn't afford to come down taking too long.
Vampire fighters have figured prominently in the post-war British air races, and during the high-speed race in 1947, Cunningham broke the 100-kilometer closed circuit record. This record was again broken in April 1948 by John Derry in the DH-108.
Do not think that records are a waste of time. They usually bring to light new and useful facts, and are worthwhile from this angle, quite apart from their prestige value. I would like to say how gratifying it is to me personally to be aware of the strength and ability of our design and technical departments, which have grown to maturity during the past 30 years. Clear aims and steady application have produced technical results of a high order. It's a slow process, and there are no shortcuts that I know of. Constructive work always takes time.
In the matter of speed, we've been investigating the behavior of aircraft fitted with a gas turbine engine up to the speed of sound. We've brought back as much information as possible, partly from pilot's own report and also from an automatic recorder which contains a cine camera taking photographs of instruments in the aircraft.
Between 1948 and 49, a Goblin engine ran on test for 924 cycles of combat settings, including 100 hours at full power, to complete 1,000 hours.
Air Marshal Sir Alec Corriton, controller of supplies air, shut down the engine at the end of the 1,000th hour. The three technical executives most concerned were Major Halford, head of the engine company, Mr. John Brodie, the director in charge of the engineering division, and Dr. Moult, the chief engineer.
Flying fast helps us to fly faster.
Yes, that is because air for combustion is rammed into the engine. With an efficient forward-facing intake, a speed of even 600 miles an hour at 40,000 feet is sufficient to double the effective pressure ratio of the power plant. Moreover, this added pressure ratio is obtained very efficiently, as high as 85%.
In plain English, if we can so design this duct that we can ram the air direct into the compressor, then the faster we fly, the more efficient the airplane becomes.
Seems in jet propulsion, you know, we're getting a lot for nothing. Nothing, in fact, seems to succeed like success.
In July 1948, a formation of vampires from No. 54 Fighter Squadron, Royal Air Force, set out to make the first jet aircraft crossing of the Atlantic, and then on to a tour of North America and Canada. At Hatfield, innovative developments included wind tunnel facilities for testing the ever larger propellers then coming into service.
The twin wind tunnels for testing de Havilland propellers takes all kinds of piston engine and propeller turbine up to 6,000 horsepower and propellers up to 20 feet in diameter. By the end of 1949, there were some 9,000 de Havilland propellers in service with 300 operators. The range extends from the manually variable pitch propeller for 100 horsepower up to 6-blade counter-rotating types for the Shackleton reconnaissance aircraft, and the 17-feet 8-blade counter-rotator for the Saro Princess flying boat.
We went into the factory, and it was really the luck of the draw, and I was very lucky because I went into the experimental fitting shop. I think it was literally a lottery, where, you know, which department you were sent to. And this was very exciting because there were some quite hush-hush things coming along. They were building the 110 prototype, and working on the development of the Vampire into the Venom and that type of thing. All handwork at the bench with the gods like Mr. Bishop and Sir Geoffrey and Mr. Walker walking through from time to time. Great privilege to be there.
1949 was a busy year at Hatfield. Two new fighters emerged, both logical developments. In the late summer, work on the Venom and two-seat night fighter Vampire reached fever pitch in order that both aircraft might be ready for the SPAC display at Farnborough. Geoffrey Pike was first away in the night fighter, whilst the experimental staff worked unceasingly on the Venom. Just in time, John Derry took the Venom off on September the 2nd.
Towards the end of the Second World War, de Havilland had instigated a design study for a jet airliner. Thinking was initially on twin-boom three-engine configuration, but the revolutionary concept of the DH-106, with 4 de Havilland Ghost engines giving a total of 20,000 pounds of thrust, was finalised. The designers at Hatfield produced a sleek and purposeful shape, which would be known to all as the Comet. A prototype nose section was grafted onto a Horsa glider for the air testing of windscreen visibility in rain. The new concept of nose wheel undercarriage was tested on a converted truck chassis. R.E. Bishop led the design team in what would be Hatfield's greatest achievement, the Comet airliner.
So many outstanding aeroplanes from Hatfield, so many innovative aeroplanes, but I suppose it would have to be the Comet, the most significant. Many people have said it was a bigger step for aviation than Concorde was. First jet transport aeroplane immediately after the war would have to be the most significant, I suppose.
The tail had to be dragged right down to clear the hangar roof, and the device to do this was quite an ingenious thing. And once you had manually hauled the whole thing down to clear the roof, it was tracted out. It's quite an exercise in manual labour, really.
As the graceful-looking, futuristic shape emerged, all at Hatfield felt at the leading edge of aviation.
It is evident now that the jet airliner, with speeds around 500 miles an hour, can be made to pay, and that such speeds are not just an expensive luxury. In this new form of air travel, Britain has the chance to make up the leeway lost in the war, when we were developing combat aircraft to the exclusion of all else.
Before that, of course, I'd had the enormous advantage of flying the engine in Vampire. The high altitude was done with the Ghost engine, of which 4 were in the Comet. So I knew the handling of the engine and the marvelous smoothness of jets, which I'd experienced, of course, in the Vampire. And knowing the design team, and the enormous amount of work that had been done on the power control system, I felt totally confident that the aeroplane would be a joy to fly, which indeed it was.
Let me say, therefore, that the picture I see is the result of the kind of leadership which Sir Geoffrey de Havilland has given us for nearly 30 years, through thick and thin, and that he must be as proud of creating it as we are to be part of it.
The Comet had flown on the birthdays of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland and John Cunningham.
Beautifully smooth, fast, and it behaved superbly.
Came in to a spontaneous ovation. Men who had worked a couple of years on the aircraft could at once sense that their product was a basically sound aeroplane.
The passenger jet age was born from de Havilland. All who saw the Comet were spellbound, and there were many visits to the company.
Well, I think the most important one was the visit of the Queen Mother to Hatfield with Princess Margaret in 1952. And I think it was decided rather at the last minute that it would be a good idea if a bouquet was presented, and probably expected. And I was chosen to present it. So I had to rehearse. And my mother had a home help at the time called Mrs. Mill. And she stood in for the Queen Mother in her tartan turban and flowered pinafore. And my mother was Sergeant Major and drilled me beautifully to curtsy. And the prop was a bunch of dead lilac, which she got out of our dustbin for the bouquet. And it all went very well. And the plane came in and the Queen Mother descended the steps and she did her stuff beautifully and came up to me and said, "Are those for me?" And I then stepped forward and gave her the flowers, but completely forgot to curtsy. So I was pushed down at the last minute by my mother into a semblance of a curtsy. So the rehearsal was a total waste of time, as far as I was concerned. But I suppose Mrs. Miller was able to say afterwards, "Well, I do a very good Queen Mother."
The Comet entered service with BOAC to an enthralled public. But then tragedy occurred. On the 10th of January 1954, a BOAC comet, Yoke-Peter, after taking off from Rome, disappeared into the sea with no survivors. And so commenced a traumatic period for de Havilland, which eventually meant extensive redesign to regain certification of the comet. It was a severe blow for British aviation.
Boeing, Lockheed and Douglas, all without exception, said to de Havilland that we're extremely sorry for the enormous setback you suffered, but that if you had not suffered that fatigue failure on a pressure cabin, one of us would undoubtedly have had problems there, and we benefited, and that's where pioneers very often do not get the benefit of their pioneering work. And as a consequence, we lost the 3 or 4 years advantage that we had over Boeing, as it happened to be, who produced the 707 shortly, or put it into service very shortly after the rebuilt Comet, which was the Comet 4.
Powered by Rolls-Royce Avons, the relaunched Comet set new standards of performance. A Comet 3, the redesigned predecessor of the 4, had been taken on a world tour by John Cunningham in 1955, and it impressed all who saw it.
The well-loaded aircraft again displays its sprightly takeoff and steep initial climb. Back in Sydney, the Comet and its Rolls-Royce engines call for hardly any attention. A weekend off duty, and on we go again. The vast ocean of the Pacific lies before us. How do you fancy yourself back in the English winter? I don't.
The Comet was being assembled. The 110, which became the Sea Vixen, was in the experimental department at the time. On the engine company side, they were working on the Gyron series of engines, rocket motors.
Such diverse activity at Hatfield was unified by the inspired management approach of de Havilland's, which attracted many to the company.
I mean, it was typified really by the standard de Havilland script, which was used for all their publicity material. You only had to see a piece of paper to know that it came from de Havilland's, even if it hadn't got the name of the company on it. And that was sort of typical of the elegance, I suppose, that the company always exhibited in all that it did. I went on to the Sea Vixen, which was a very interesting project indeed. I was looking after the stressing of the tail unit.
The Sea Vixen was equipped with armaments also developed at Hatfield.
Apart from carrier duties, the Sea Vixen can also operate from land bases. With its advanced radar, guided missiles, and its outstanding climb capabilities, it probably comprises the most advanced weapon system now available.
The Manor Road site, on the far side of the runway, had become one of the country's most advanced research and development centres, not only of engines and propellers, but rockets and missiles also.
The de Havilland Firestreak is an air-launched infrared homing missile. It seeks and destroys its target at all altitudes up to the greatest height from which manned air attack can be made.
The Firestreak was Britain's first operational air-to-air missile. De Havilland propellers had, by the end of the war, established an enviable reputation and were ready to meet the demands of the future.
Modern aircraft engines have increased in power, and propeller blades have had to be redesigned to absorb this increased output. Hollow steel blades with the required features have been designed and manufactured by de Havilland's under license from the Hamilton Standard Division of the United Aircraft Corporation of America.
Design studies on wind generators used de Havilland blade technology. Inevitably, in the jet age, demand for propellers was falling off. New outlets for Hatfield's design talents were urgently needed, So missile and space development led to work on the Blue Streak project. Originally intended as an intercontinental ballistic missile, the main fuselage structure was fabricated at Hatfield. The intercontinental missile plan was cancelled in 1960, but Blue Streak formed the basis of a satellite launcher in a joint venture with France and Germany. Launches were made from Woomera in Australia. De Havilland at Hatfield by the end of the 1950s was the centre of an organisation which employed 37,000 people worldwide. The Comet had sold well. The Dove was everybody's favourite business express.
Beach okay.
And the Heron was its rugged four-engine counterpart. But government policy at the time was that individual aircraft companies should merge, and in 1960 de Havilland became a division of the Hawker Siddeley Group.
When in fact they were merged with Hawker Siddeley, this world enterprise really became the basis of Hawker Siddeley's worldwide capability in aerospace, because none of the other aircraft manufacturers had gone to the same trouble of cultivating the overseas markets.
Back in 1956, British European Airways had defined their requirements for a new airliner, capable of lifting 100 passengers and with a range of 1,000 miles at 600 miles per hour. De Havilland's answer was the DH-121.
On the 4th of August 1961, at Hatfield, the de Havilland Trident, the first three-engine jet airliner, was wheeled off the assembly line. The Trident is powered by 3 Rolls-Royce Spey bypass turbines. These engines provide a significant advance in propulsion efficiency and economy. This is the airliner for the mid-60s onwards, specially designed for regional operation.
I spent 2 or 3 years on Tridents, right through to the Trident 3, working out all the design loads. Of course, originally we did it all with slide rules and log tables, and then I remember the first computers arrived and we started getting quite sophisticated in the way we analysed the loads. I'm not sure that it made aeroplanes any safer, but it certainly gave a great atmosphere of reliability about what we were doing.
This particular Trident sitting behind us is one that I was in command of on its first flight. The Trident was a delightful aircraft to fly. It was very much a pilot's aeroplane.
The three-engine formula meets the pilot's plea for safe and easy handling with one engine inoperative.
On the tail end of the Trident we had a spin chute. Well, in the course of a very long approach to Hatfield 24, extended runway centre line, somehow or other the spin chute was released. I won't go into the details of how, it was a bit of finger trouble. But the sequel to it really, or the funny bit, was that the chute actually landed over the horns of some farmer way out's prime milking herd best cow, and she was racing around the field with this thing attached to her horns. So he, being very irate, obviously phoned up and complained bitterly about this so-and-so great lump of silk hanging over his cow.
The Trident, fitted with Autoland, was to become the world's first commercial airliner able to land in fog. test pilots Ron Clear and Jimmy Phillips demonstrated an autoland approach into Hatfield.
Over to the pilot.
We are now lined up on the ILS beam in line with the runway. We're descending down the glide path and we have completed the checklist. That is, we have lowered the undercarriage and flaps and made all the actions necessary to carry out an automatic landing. Ron Clear, one of our senior test pilots, is acting as co-pilot for this flight, and he is monitoring the performance of the system. Normally, for an operational approach, both pilots would be doing this job. At the moment, we're passing 450 feet on the radio altimeters, and this means that we have approximately 1.5 miles to run to touchdown. The autopilot is controlling the airplane, the flight path of the airplane, and the automatic throttles on the 2 outboard engines are controlling the speed of the airplane. We're now passing 200 feet with 3/4 mile to run. The landing will commence at 65 feet, at which point the throttles will close and the autopilot will pitch the nose of the airplane up for the landing flare. The flare is now beginning, and we should very shortly be touching down round about now.
In 1963, the de Havilland name disappeared in the United Kingdom and became incorporated into the Hawker Siddeley Group. The loss of the historic company's identity was regretted by many.
On the day that we ceased to be de Havillands and became Hawker Siddeley, I was flying R.E. Bishop's son in a Heron. The designer had asked me to take his 16-year-old son for a flight. Dick asked me what I thought about Hawker Siddeley taking over from de Havilland, and I said I hope they retain the name. I also, out of deference to his age, used no expletives, but I was not happy that we had ceased to be de Havilland, and I thought that commercially it would be a mistake that we became known as Hawker Siddeley. Unknown to myself, I had an open transmitter, and everything that I was saying to him was being transmitted over the whole of the contractor's fields. I think my career went on a plateau.
Hatfield continued to thrive as a major aerospace centre.
Those at Hatfield still regard themselves very much as the de Havilland boys, as it were, and the de Havilland spirit lived on, and we were very proud of what we did here. And if you go around the world, anybody in the aviation business had always heard of Hatfield, and you'd invariably bump into old boys who'd worked here.
Stringers are bonded to skin panels by the redux process, extensively used by de Havilland for 20 years.
The Trident was in popular service with BEA, but the world's airlines wanted a larger aircraft.
The Trident was not big enough for what the rest of the world wanted. It was tailored for BEA, who wanted a rather, well, Trident 1 size aircraft with very high performance and for use in Europe from long runways. The world outside wanted fairly high performance, not necessarily as high as the Trident had, but they needed shorter takeoff and landing runs. And we at Hatfield realized that the Trident 1 was not an aeroplane that the world would really want, and that we would have to build a later version, slightly larger, to satisfy the world.
This new version of the Trident has more powerful Rolls-Royce Spey 25 engines of increased thrust, allowing operations at higher weights. With a 60% increase in fuel tankage, the Trident 1E can fly over twice as far as the earlier Trident 1. And with a greater wingspan and flap area, and more advanced high-lift devices along the leading edge, it has greatly improved airfield performance. The Trident 1E uses the same airframe structure, systems and equipment as the Trident 1, thus reducing many of the high costs normally associated with the introduction of a new aircraft type into service. As a result, the Trident 1E is now in service are already providing a level of reliability seldom achieved even after several years of operational experience.
Our attempts to sell the Trident to China, which history records, in fact we were successful in doing, but it did mean that our sales team from Hatfield had to spend many a week, if not a month, stuck in behind the bamboo curtain in Peking, negotiating very carefully with the Chinese over a very long period of time in order to achieve these sales. But it was certainly a feather in our cap when eventually the Chinese signed up for the Trident.
Small, innovative airliners in miniature had always been a de Havilland success story, and the DH-125, first flown in 1962, was a classic example of the company reaching the right market at the right time. It could transport at jet speeds and in airline comfort the businessman in a hurry. First known as the Jet Dragon, the DH-125 was a 6 to 8-seater and was the first executive jet. It, like the Moth so many years before, became an immediate bestseller. It continues in production today, proof of the sound original design. Hatfield welcomed many well-known visitors, and in the mid-1970s, Howard Hughes flew in.
He actually asked if he could base his airplane here while he was visiting Europe, and we agreed. He was a very eccentric individual, and amongst other things, he refused to let anybody actually see him board his airplane. We had to build a special ramp to allow him access to his airplane on his wheelchair, and when he came in, he would only leave at night. And he demanded that any ground crew in the hangar at the time had to turn their backs as he boarded the airplane.
On the death of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland in 1965, it seemed that the de Havilland era was finally over. But with royal visits continuing, a unique pride still existed here.
The first royal visit we had that I'm aware of was a visit in the war by King George VI. And the last visit I'm aware of was during the 80s, a visit by Duke of Edinburgh. And he came, he toured the whole factory, and as usual we allowed the employees very close contact, and they were able to view his progress through the site. And Hatfield very much on and up in those days, and very much the centre of the aviation world, in fact. And we were very proud of these visits that we had here.
In 1977, the major manufacturers in UK aviation became nationalised, and British Aerospace was formed. At Hatfield, Prince Philip came to see the new 4-engine regional jet, the 146.
Very soon, something revolutionary will happen to feeder line services. The name of the revolution is 146. The British Aerospace 146. Unlike most revolutions, this will happen quietly. Very quietly. Yes, a very versatile turbofan aircraft. Name the location anywhere in the world. The 146 fits the picture perfectly. So perfectly that this aircraft will operate from remote airstrips and link townships with major population centers. It'll bring jet travel to the developing world.
From a pilot's point of view, it's a classic de Havilland aeroplane. All de Havilland aeroplanes are delightful to fly, largely because Sir Geoffrey, of course, was the test pilot as well as the chief designer originally. And the 146 is exactly the same. It's delightful to fly. It has no vices, very flexible aeroplane, and is now becoming very popular. The airlines are becoming very keen on it.
The 146, produced in 3 variants, has been relaunched as the Avro RJ, and demand is high. 146s make profits quietly for large and small airlines alike, worldwide.
The most unusual would have to be Bhutan, Truk Air in Bhutan. The airfield is in the high Himalayas. It's right in the bottom of a valley. The approach is a valley approach, and you're turning finals without seeing the runway. The runway appears over a little ridge at about 1.5 miles finals, and that's a fascinating operation, most extraordinary operation.
The 146 was the last aircraft to be assembled at Hatfield. Its popularity with pilots and passengers alike, an enduring tribute to de Havilland design philosophy. Once a year, open days were held at the site, when all were welcome.
One year, I was taking some friends around, and I think it was an Argentinian Comet 4 came in from Chester just on a delivery flight on the Saturday. And these friends of mine said, "Why don't you have flying for the public?" So I thought, that's a good idea. Other people always have the good ideas, and I just developed them. And I had a word with John Cunningham, and he agreed that next year we should put on a modest flying program. We had an excellent flying display. It was a free one, of course, always free. And then I got into trouble for having organised it without going through the Ministry of Defence Participation Committee. Well, I learnt a lesson there.
This was a day when proud employees of a major world enterprise could show their families just what they did and see products past and present in the air.
It was very much a family business, and all ex-employees that I've met always say what a friendly company it was to work for.
You used to get Sir Geoffrey and one or two other of the directors constantly coming round, keeping an interest in the progress. Now they'd probably come up to you and say, "Oh, now, hello Alan, what are you doing today?" He would always have the courtesy to go and find out what your name was before he'd come talk with you.
And I was a de Havilland apprentice at the time, and I was dispatched with a drawing on an envelope to go down to the wood shop, to the mock-up shop, to get some offcuts of ply. So I found the foreman in charge and asked him for some bits of ply. He asked what for. I said, "A job for Mr. Bishop." He said, "Which Bishop?" Because there was the company doctor was also Bishop. And I said, "R.E." And he said, "Oh, that miserable old bugger, I suppose it's for his bloody boat again, is it?"
Aviation development had progressed a long way from the first days of the de Havilland Aircraft Company. From a wooden hut at Stag Lane, where the Moth design was born, to Hatfield's initiation of the Airbus story.
First project was the HBM 100, which was the first idea of an Airbus. And Hawker Siddeley pursued this, and eventually the British government and the French government agreed to go ahead with this aeroplane, but then we were told Breguet and Nord were to have nothing to do with the project. We were going to work with Sud Aviation, of course, who designed the Concorde with Bristol. Well, that started years of international travel. We were flying up and down to Toulouse, Munich, Amsterdam, incessantly. We were going abroad 2 and 3 times every week.
The success story that was Hatfield was, in the late 1980s, drawing to a close. A worldwide drop in demand for commercial aircraft due to a severe recession resulted in drastic rationalization. And in 1992, the closure of the site was announced. The workers at Hatfield, winners of 2 Queen's Awards for export achievement, realized that the regional jet market could not sustain the site. In 1994, on a wind-swept April day, the de Havilland Moth Club arranged a final bittersweet open day to celebrate the part de Havilland at Hatfield played in world aviation.
Lord of space and time, we bow our heads, remembering those who gave their talents, devotion, and even their lives to make Hatfield and its aircraft famous the world over, because I believe that where we stand is, in a sense, holy ground.
Whilst the Chipmunk took off to make one final fly past, it was a time to reflect. On the machines and the men who, from this Hatfield factory, influenced the course of aviation worldwide for more than 60 years.
Clear aims and steady application have produced technical results of a high order. And to conclude, I give you my thanks and good wishes, and hope that the old spirit will long animate our joint endeavors.
And when you look at the de Havilland company at Hatfield, they conceived everything from moths to the Mosquito, jet airliners, the world's first jet airliner, jet fighters, the first supersonic aeroplane in Britain. So they covered the whole of the aircraft side. They also developed jet engines, piston engines, propellers, guided missiles and space rockets. And I don't believe there's anywhere else in the world that has conceived that total range of aerospace capability. And it really gives some indication of the leadership of the de Havilland organization that brought that creativity.
Well, I think it was very much from little acorns, great oaks grow, you know, from a field in Hampshire to a worldwide enterprise.
I have been extremely fortunate in that I started here flying in 1938 in the days of all wooden aircraft. And all the de Havilland aircraft up to that time were built of wood. But the tremendous performance developments that Hatfield had been responsible for, whether during the war, the Mosquito, one of the fastest aeroplanes built during the war, or the Vampire and its developments post-war, de Havillands have usually led the way in high-performance aircraft.
The technicians liked the look of her very much. A few straight hops, and off she went on her first flight.
And in the evening, when the press had departed, and after a 6th practice run, Cunningham took the Comet off on a 31-minute flight before a crowd of workers who had just knocked off for the day, climbed to 10,000 feet, and then flew along the runway at 100 feet in salute.
The Comet developed progressively working stages up to nearly 3,000 miles, as well as short haul. It has served worldwide routes, acknowledged as the best medium-size airliner of its time.
Air-launched missiles developed at Hatfield included Firestreak, Martel, Skyflash, Sea Eagle, and Alarm.
These rigs and many others saved considerable development time and contributed greatly to the shortness of the period between the drawing board and the first flight on January the 9th, 1962.
I believe it was the most innovative group of aircraft designers anywhere in the world. How many other companies designed a jet airliner, designed their own engine and put it in it? The Trident with the world's first civil autoland. There are so many things at Hatfield.